Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And a very good afternoon to our dear listeners of IKIM FM. Welcome to this special interview. I'm your host, Patricia Afrina. Thank you very much for listening to us today. And inshallah, for this episode, I'm honored to be given the opportunity to talk to a distinguished scholar. It's Dr. Hellyer, a British geopolitical analyst and also a scholar of security studies, political economy, history and religion. And his study focuses on the modern Middle East, Europe and Southeast Asia. He's a Carnegie Endowment for International Peace Scholar and a Senior Associate Fellow at the Royal United Service Institute's International Security Studies Program. Welcome to the studio, Dr. Hellyer. Assalamualaikum, Doctor.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for joining us in the studio. So, Doctor, you as an expert, a scholar who specializes in politics and international relations, particularly in the Arab world. So in this interview, I would like to ask you on the issue of Israel's occupation of Palestine. So to start with, let's start with the assassination of the political leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, in Tehran. He was heavily involved in the mediated talks and negotiation regarding hostages between Israel and Hamas. So what will be the fate of the Gaza hostages and ceasefire negotiations now that Haniyeh, who acted as a key interlocutor with international mediators, has been killed?
So the negotiations, I think, have taken quite a heavy blow with his assassination. They didn't end as a result of his assassination. Actually, they continued, but I think over the last 24, 36 hours, they've really taken, turned. It's interesting to see why. Israeli sources themselves are actually blaming Benjamin Netanyahu for the fall of the negotiations, because he's constantly changing the goalposts. And the negotiators themselves, very senior Israeli officials, they don't seem to be at all happy with the way that he's proceeding. And there have been a number of leaks in the Israeli press that indicate that he doesn't want them to succeed, that actually Netanyahu wants the war to continue for purely domestic political reasons, even if that means that he doesn't get the hostages back. And I think that's true. I think that's exactly his game plan, that he doesn't want the war to end at the present time.
And talking about that, additionally, actually last week, Benjamin Netanyahu also confirmed that Israel killed a Hezbollah commander in Beirut, Lebanon, and the Israel Defense Forces claimed that the senior military leader was responsible for a missile strike that killed 12 children. However, Netanyahu did not claim or issue any statement regarding this assassination. So why does this difference between the response?
I think this is quite typical, to be honest with you, when it comes to assassinating in a targeted killing in Beirut of a Hezbollah commander, following the killings in Majd al-Shams in the occupied Golan Heights. That's one thing. When it comes to admitting the assassination of a political personality that they were negotiating with in a foreign capital like Tehran, I think that's different. Having said that, I don't think anybody really doubts that it's Israel.
And talking about, I'd like to touch on the accountability. As we know that between late last year and early this year, South Africa initiated legal proceedings against Israel at the International Court of Justice, accusing it of violating Genocide Convention through its action in Gaza. So now that it has been a few months, what's next from that?
That case will take a very long time, and I don't think anybody should be expecting any result from it in a short period. The case is likely to take several years. What we will get are, every so often different hearings, but a final verdict is not going to come through for quite some time. I think that there's a good chance that the South Africans will prove their case. But to be honest with you, these cases are always very, very difficult to prove. And even if it's true that genocide is being carried out according to the law, the judges have to base their verdict on the basis of evidence that is provided and according to procedure and so on. So this happens very often in legal cases, that even if the guilty party is actually guilty, they may be found innocent by the court because the case wasn't argued properly or proven according to certain procedures, right? So we don't know the outcome, but I think that there's a lot of evidence that the South Africans could use to prove their case. It's the biggest issue is about intention, and I think that there's a lot of material to show intention, but again, it's about proving it according to standards laid down in law.
And how do you think that the outcome of this case, in which of course it's going to take years, but how do you think that it's going to affect the future cases when it involves something that involve international human rights?
So again, the Genocide Convention is a pretty focused piece of law, and even if the case wasn't proven as far as the court is concerned, I don't think that means that you suddenly have some sort of downturn of accountability in international human rights law. Nor does it necessarily mean that if the case were proven, then suddenly other things become easier. I think it's a very, very specific case. So, for example, genocide was proven when it came to Srebrenica in the Bosnian genocide, right? And that was, in the 90s. And more than 20 years later, we're having this case, and but I don't know if it made any difference, unfortunately, that case was proven back in the 90s. So I would be cautious about predicting too much. What I think a broader question is about accountability, just more generally, and unfortunately, the reason why we've seen the last 9-10 months of carnage in the Gaza Strip at the hands of the Israeli Defense Forces is precisely because they feel that there isn't accountability, that there's impunity, and there is. And that's primarily due to the United States and the Biden administration continuously supporting the Israeli state in this regard, even if they are unhappy with how the war is being conducted. And by the way, I think that they are. I think that Biden himself really dislikes Netanyahu. I think that the Biden administration more generally would be tremendously happy if the war stopped, if the bombings hadn't taken place. But frankly, none of that is relevant. It's not relevant how they feel. It's not relevant what they say. It's relevant what they do. And what they've done in policy terms is to continuously underwrite and support Israel at every step of the way.
And talking about the support, we know that the Western influence, especially from the United States and also the European Union, is significant in this issue, and it seems like nothing will change until they withdraw their support for Israel. So considering South Africa's move to take Israel to the ICJ, what are other efforts can be taken by other countries to hold Israel accountable for its actions?
So the reality is that Israel is tremendously dependent on the United States and tremendously independent from pretty much everywhere else in comparison. So I don't think that Israel is going to change its behavior until it sees that there's accountability for it and there's a price for it. And as long as the United States continues in this fashion, there simply won't be. That's Israel, the state, just more generally. Netanyahu, I think that's true for him, obviously, as well. I also think that there are domestic considerations for Netanyahu that external forces can't really affect. So the real pressure that I think outside forces could do really relates to indirect bilateral pressure on the United States. And I just don't see very much of that taking place at the moment. Again, there's some rhetoric, but I'm not sure much more than that. You've seen some moves, change in recent weeks. So, for example, Kamala Harris is now the presumptive Democrat presidential nominee. Her rhetoric has been stronger than Biden, but of course, the policy is the same, and I don't expect there to be any change at the moment because, again, she's the serving vice president, right? I expect her, frankly, if she becomes president, to be better, but I wouldn't presume that she would be much better. Okay. When it comes to other forces internationally, the United Kingdom has a new government, and the Labour government,
Yes.
and that matters, as in the UK matters, because it is probably the closest ally to the United States in the international arena, and they've taken somewhat a harder line on Israel than the previous government did. Now, having said that, that's a pretty low bar. But for example, they reinstituted funding for UNRWA, which the previous government had suspended. They withdrew their objection at the ICC, the International Criminal Court, for the on the case about arrest warrants for Israeli and Hamas officials. And there's talk of them restricting arms sales, but we won't know too much about that, I think, for some months. So more indirect pressure, I think, would have an effect, but it's really about the United States, in my opinion.
The power of boycott, now that we know it's happening all around the world,
Uh-huh.
do you think it is significant in giving pressure towards Israel?
I don't think that the boycott does very much in terms of this particular crisis, as in this particular phase, because I don't think that Israel is going to stop or intensify or maintain its bombardment of Gaza on the basis of that. So that's a different discussion, and the discussion around the effectiveness of the boycott is a genuine discussion. I think that there's a lot to that, but it doesn't immediately impact upon this. It could do in other things, but not particularly when it comes to the bombardment of Gaza.
And on social media, when I was scrolling through social media and look on it about this issue, I see that there's a conversation about how people being accused of being, if anti-Zionist, the terms of anti-Zionist and also anti-Semitism whenever you're against the Zionism. And apart of that, there is also the accusation of people being radicalized. So how can we make progress when Zionists accuse people of radicalization whenever they support Hamas? What are your thoughts on this?
So first of all, I just want to be very clear here. There are people who are anti-Semites. There are people who are anti-Jewish. And there are people who are anti-Zionist. And sometimes these things do overlap, but not always. But sometimes they do. I mean, you have many Israelis who are very opposed to Israeli actions in Gaza. Okay? They're also Zionists. Okay, so there is that, right? There's that sort of spectrum. You also have other Israelis who are against Zionism as a political philosophy. So there's also that. Okay, you have many people who are not Israelis, but are Jewish and are in the United States or in the United Kingdom and are very opposed to Zionism and to the state of Israel. In fact, there have been many Jews involved in the protests in the United States, in the UK, and elsewhere. Some of the largest ones in the United States were actually organized by Jewish Americans. So I feel like, people just have to be very clear that there isn't necessarily, this, the Venn diagram isn't exact, right? That to be, for example, Jewish is to support this or to oppose that. I don't think people like it very much when assumptions are made about what opinions Muslims might have as a result of their being Muslim. And I think people should also accord that same courtesy when it comes to Jews. And for that matter, everybody else, right? We know this in the history of Zionism as a political philosophy. We know this in terms of just looking at the political spectrum within the West and within the United Kingdom, within the state of Israel itself, and so on. Okay, but just to be very clear, there are people who are anti-Semitic.
Yes.
There are people who hate Jews for being Jews. And unfortunately, we do see that element. I think a problem is that when we see that element, we also see people seizing upon that element and insisting that this represents the vast majority of protesters or objectors or whatever, which of course is wrong. In this, we've had protests in the UK, I think almost weekly for the past 9 months, and constantly the right-wing and far right-wing press in the UK say, these are, anti-Jewish, or these are supportive of violence and supportive of Hamas and supportive of, these sorts of things. And the reality is that they found a tiny element here or a tiny element there that might have said something stupid or said something wrong and very insulting. But, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, and you found a handful here, a handful there. And in every large-scale protest or march, you're going to find people that say things that are not remotely representative of the majority or even of a significant minority. So I think people should just be very consistent. And I think also people should recognize that, this is a very emotive subject for anybody that has a heart. Okay? And sometimes as a result of that, very deep and very justified emotional attachment, we don't always pay attention to facts, and we pay attention to just, our feelings.
Yes.
So, for example, I've seen a lot of things on social media where there are pictures of atrocities that have taken place, and there's a caption saying this is what the Israelis did here, okay, in Gaza. And it isn't. It's actually what, for example, the Syrian army did against civilians in Syria, for example, right? And I've seen lots of pictures like that because unfortunately there are many very similar looking scenes. And people think it doesn't matter. I think it does matter, because if you allow for that breakdown of verification and authenticity, then you give people the excuse that, all of these pictures and videos that I've seen of atrocities in Gaza, they're all fake. And of course, the overwhelming majority of these pictures and videos are not fake, that there are horrible atrocities going on. But if you allow, that sort of trend to become fixed and deeply ingrained, I think it then casts a bad shadow on other things that go on. And again, you've seen this many times. Sometimes it's very intentional.
Yes.
Okay. So, for example, describing the Golan Heights as northern Israel is just wrong. It's factually wrong. It's not northern Israel. It's the occupied Golan Heights. It's Syrian territory. Okay. Sometimes people know, sometimes people don't know, but I think that's very clear. But then, these pictures, some of these pictures, of course, in the grand scheme of things, very small number, but it's important for people to verify what they share. It's not that hard. It really isn't that hard. But people just, they scroll, they retweet, they share, and they don't really check. And I think people should try to be a bit more exacting.
And talking about protests in the UK, I would like to leave you with one last question, and this pertains to the Southport stabbing that we have known for the last few days, where it started as a case of a 17-year-old stabbed 3 children to death during a dance class, and the suspect was born in Britain, but in the hours after the attack, his information about his identity, including the false claim that he was an undocumented migrant, spread rapidly online, and this escalates into violent far-right protests and riots. And social media has been used to spread rumors about immigrants and also Islamophobia. And this is actually, in my opinion, is a classic example of how vulnerable Muslim communities are to be blamed whenever there's an incident involving mass killing or public violence in Western societies. So I believe that the global community has a responsibility to challenge these harmful narratives that link Islam with terrorism. So in what ways can the global community work to dismantle the harmful narrative that links Islam with terrorism?
So I'm English. It's very concerning for me. I've not been back for the past week, so all of this took place while I was away. So it's very concerning for me to see all of this while I am away. I would say that the issue of spreading false news about minorities is, of course, not limited to the UK. That indeed in many of our Muslim societies, you find people doing that.
Yes.
I'm not talking about a particular place, but I could. There are many, many examples, unfortunately, across the world where we've seen that take place. And it's part of the same sickness, in my opinion, where we problematize the other in order to get away from, facing deep issues about ourselves. And I think that we should all recognize that that's, an illness that we all need to address. When it comes to the West, the issue of Islamophobia, the issue of anti-Muslim bigotry, is one that is not a few days or a few weeks or a few months or even a few years old. It goes back decades. And one of the reasons why it has become so powerful in the West is that within the mainstream, not within the far right, not within the margins, not within the fringes, but within the mainstream, Islamophobia has been made quote-unquote respectable. It is past the quote-unquote dinner table test, okay? And when you have that mainstreaming taking place, it's actually far more dangerous than these far right or these, marginal extremist figures saying this or that or the other. Because once it gets into the mainstream, then it's mainstream political parties, it's mainstream media outlets, it's mainstream public figures that pick this stuff up and they spread it around much more effectively than these, radical marginal figures. And I think that, this is a great challenge for us in the UK. I think that the space for challenging in the UK is much better than many other European countries and many other Western countries. But there's a big responsibility here on our public figures, starting from the Prime Minister himself all the way down. There's a big responsibility upon them to face this challenge, really head on, and to make sure that it's very clear that this isn't the result of, one or two, people. This isn't the result of a radical fringe. This is the result of years and decades of the mainstream tolerating and very often amplifying this sort of bigoted rhetoric against Muslims and against people of color, against minorities. And if we want to have a society where everyone is respected, where social cohesion is upheld, then we should take that really seriously from now.
And with that being said, I would like to thank Dr. Ismail Haniyeh for his insight onto this topic, the Israel's occupation of Palestine, and we hope that today's sharing will be beneficial to those who are listening to us either through radio or even through our social media pages, Facebook and YouTube. And again, Doctor, thank you very much for being with us. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Thank you so much.